Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Washington, Executive Director of the ESG Center here at the Conference Board. The ESG Center focuses on issues of corporate governance, sustainability, and philanthropy. Um, Sorry, we're having some technical issues here. I'm delighted to moderate and welcome you to today's edition of Sustainability Watch, which focuses on the topic of benefit corporations. In concept, benefit corporations seem like they should be the perfect answer to what many people are looking for in companies today. By law, benefit corporations are required to serve a public purpose, and their directors are required to consider the interests of multiple stakeholders, not just stockholders, in decision making. But even though there are thousands of benefit corporations in the United States, there is a fair amount of confusion and a lot of questions about them, including whether they're living up to their original promise. Today we're going to try to clear up some of that confusion, answer those questions, and talk about how benefit corporations can live up to their full potential with two experts. Dr. Ellen Berry is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. She's the author of a recent Conference Board publication, Organizational Characteristics of U.S. Benefit Corporations, as well as an underlying excellent research paper on which that publication is based. Welcome, Ellen.
Great to be here.
Holly Ensign-Barstow is Director of Stakeholder Governance and Policy for B-Lab, a nonprofit that has been not only a driving force behind the creation of benefit corporations, but also provides such services as B Corporate certifications and impact assessments. So welcome to both of you. Today, before we begin, I've got some housekeeping matters to deal with. First, we're offering CPA credit for participating in today's live program. To get this credit, you need to request it by entering your full name, email address, and specify CPE in the Request CPE credit space at the bottom of your screen. Please note that 3 pop-up messages will occur during the program to confirm your participation. Please click OK each time you see one. You need to stay online for the entire webcast. Second, I want to underscore that we welcome audience participation in today's session. You can ask questions at any time by entering them in the chat box at the bottom left of your screen. We'll work them into conversation as best we can as time permits, so please ask some questions. Finally, a few other housekeeping notes. You can download the slide deck of today's presentation in the download section at the bottom of your screen. You can enlarge the video to full screen view by clicking on the 4 arrows in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And please feel free to share this program with your colleagues after the fact, as it'll be available on demand. And then please complete the evaluation at the end of today's session so that we can incorporate your feedback into future webcasts. Lastly, for those who want an optimal viewing experience, we encourage you to close other applications during the broadcast, as having too many apps open can slow the performance. And now, with that out of the way, let's talk about benefit corporations. Before we get into some of the findings from Ellen's research, let's clarify the difference between benefit corporations and B Corps. Sometimes people use those terms interchangeably, but they certainly aren't. Holly, could you explain how benefit corporations and B Corps are different?
Sure. Thank you, Paul. It's great to be here today. So certified B corporations, or B Corp certification, often just called B Corp, is a business certification conferred by the nonprofit B Lab. It's akin to organic for milk or fair trade for coffee, except it's comprehensive. So it evaluates every area of a company's operations and impact, from how it treats its workers, to the environment, to the wider society. So it's not just an end product certification, it's holistic for the entire company. All certified B corporations have to do 3 things. They have to demonstrate high social and environmental performance by scoring an 80 or above on our online tool called the B Impact Assessment. They have to be transparent about that impact by having a public profile on bcorporation.net that actually gives you information about how they achieved their score. Finally, all certified B corporations must make a legal commitment to consider their stakeholders and have a broad public benefit purpose to create general public benefit. The form of that legal commitment differs depending on where the company is incorporated, as well as what type of legal entity they are. That's because the degree to which you can actually incorporate stakeholder consideration into your existing legal entity type differs depending on where you are, as well as what you are. So for example, an LLC in the United States has tons of flexibility to incorporate that stakeholder consideration into their existing operating agreement. The same is true for existing corporations in many countries around the world. So while the path to achieve that legal component for certification might differ around the world, it is a requirement for all certified B corporations. So benefit corporations, on the other hand, are a legal status that's actually passed into law through a legislative process. At the US, it's done at the state level. It's then administered by a government agency. In most states, it's the Secretary of State or a similar agency to that. It's actually an opt-in status that sits on top of the traditional corporate code. So all the same protections and permissions of a traditional corporation still apply. And you enjoy the same tax status, S or C or whatever. What changes is that you are voluntarily opting into higher obligations regarding your purpose, your accountability, and your transparency. The purpose of a benefit corporation is to create general public benefit, which is defined as a material positive impact on society and the environment. The accountability changes for a benefit corporation are that directors must consider the impact of their decisions on their stakeholders. The transparency requirement is that benefit corporations must actually report on the efforts to create general public benefit and consider their stakeholders over a certain period of time. In some states, it's 1 year. In some states, it's 2 years. It differs by jurisdiction. The difference between the two is that benefit corporations actually don't have to be certified. They don't have to obtain, certification from B Lab or any other entity. They don't have a performance requirement. So benefit corporations don't actually have to go out and achieve an 80 or above on our B impact assessment or on any other impact assessment. But they are named very similar things.
They really are. But that's really, really helpful. And other than that they have similar names, why do you think they're often confused?
B Lab created them. We created both entities, and we've been the driving force behind both. We named them similar things on purpose, actually, at the beginning. I think it's kind of come back to bite us in the butt a little bit later on. But in the beginning, it was purposeful because, press for one would generate press for the other. But I think they're often confused because they both come from B Lab. And because many certified B corporations must meet the legal requirement for certification by becoming a benefit corporation. So if you are a traditional corporation in a state that offers the benefit corporation legal status and you want to become a certified B Corp, your path to certification is going to require you to adopt that legal status. So many certified B corporations have to become benefit corporations. But honestly, the overlap between the two populations isn't huge. It's only 400 companies that are both certified and benefit corporations.
Interesting. Okay, so that's really helpful in setting. You've just done everyone a great service by clearing up some fundamental confusion. So now let's turn, if we could, to Ellen, and she did this remarkable empirical survey of and an analysis of benefit corporations. And so, Ellen, can you just give us some basic facts about the lay of the land here of benefit corporations, how many they are, where they're located, and so forth? I think you've got slides to share on
Certainly,
this
yes.
as well.
So As Holly was saying, the legislation is passed at the state level. So the ability of a firm to incorporate as a benefit corporation depends on their domicile state having legislation in effect. So this has been a rapidly changing field already. This slide, which I pulled down very recently, is already out of date. So now we've got 38 laws passed across the country. In terms of how many are working on passing legislation, that's been a bit more on hold now because of the COVID-19 crisis, but we're hoping to see a revival when that passes. So if you followed this in the news, if you've heard about benefit corporations, it's likely you've heard the names of some of the high-profile firms like Patagonia, Kickstarter, Warby Parker. I got interested in doing this study because I wanted to know kind of what's the broader range of firms out there that have become benefit corporations, what kinds of firms are becoming them, where is this happening, what are the industries, and what are they doing that they're saying is beneficial or not. Mm-hmm. So from the study, I learned that between October 2010, which is when the first statute in Maryland went into effect, and the end of 2017, we look across 35 states, over 7,700 firms had incorporated as benefit corporations. So this doesn't mean that they're still active. That is a rapidly changing dynamic as well. But we know that many firms adopted the legal form. Most of these are new firms. They're mostly small. They're mostly privately held. 94% of them were created after the legislation went into effect in their domicile state. So these are small new firms. Only 6% converted, were existing firms that converted. And often those were firms that had been around for 10 or 20 years. They were older established companies. And when I went in and looked to see what the firms were actually doing, I found that about 50% of them look like they have an online presence. If they didn't have an online presence, that didn't mean they weren't functioning, but lots of them were not active, visible online. And when I dug in even further, it looked like about 35% were online, and at least their websites gave indications that they were operating, that they were selling products or at least raising funds.
Got it. Can I ask, actually, before you, because I want to ask you about your methodology too, but that's a really interesting thing, fact about, only about 50% of these benefit corporations seem to be active online. Does that mean people just form these benefit corporations and they're not actually doing anything? And is that sort of unusual to have that kind of level of corporate incorporation and then they just don't actually do anything? I'm just curious what your impression is of that.
Well, the data on how many firms have websites is actually a smaller percentage than you might expect, and that cuts across all kinds of businesses. There's not fantastic systematic data on it, but the data that exists shows that's surprisingly low. But maybe, Holly, you could jump in here if you want to add kind of what you have a sense of being on the ground working with firms, why they might not have an online presence.
I think a lot of these are also startups, so they're in a space of just getting off the ground. I think that there are also kind of differences in the level of information available to entrepreneurs that are incorporating in these various states. So I think that there are some of these states don't offer great information to entrepreneurs when they're electing which type of entity they should incorporate as. So there's a potential that some of these entities aren't aware that they're electing benefit corporation status. There's also, a high degree of people, companies that are just companies on paper throughout the U.S. Entity election or entity population, whether that's LLCs or corporations or benefit corporations. So I can't speak to what percentage are in that category, but I think that's pretty standard across any entity type.
Got it. So in fact,
if we think back to even the leading question of the seminar of being, are benefit corporations beneficial? And I hope that's something that I'm sure that's something we'll talk about over the course of this session. Being beneficial is in the eye of the beholder. The way that the statutes are written leaves what it means to be beneficial very open-ended. States, the model legislation, suggest specific kinds of benefits, but there's a lot of room for movement. And so as I was going in and studying the topic and trying to understand, you know, are these beneficial or not, and again, very tentatively, it looked to me like of the firms that were active, of the field of benefit corporations, maybe around 18% were actually operational and at least described themselves as doing something beneficial. Mm-hmm. So okay. I think in the bigger picture, as we think about this, we need to understand the field is very varied, and that the bar to become a benefit corporation, as Holly set up, is very low in most states. And so we're just seeing a huge range of firms adopting this status.
Interesting. Okay, well, since you did some groundbreaking research here, it really is. Can you talk a little bit about the methodology, some of your additional findings?
Sure, yeah. So there's two main data sets that I'll focus on today, although three in the study. So the first one was just the step of compiling all the known benefit corporations had been created between 2010 and 2017. That in itself was a mammoth task because the legislation is passed at the state level. This information is not systematically centralized. BLAB has done a really good job trying to keep up on it, but not all states even track which firms are becoming benefit corporations. Many states do not share that information. Last I checked, Oregon was the only one where you could go to their website and download the names of the firms. You used to be able to do that in Colorado and for, I think, a brief window, Vermont. But otherwise, it means going to each individual state and hoping someone is sympathetic to you. For the firms that BLAB has not been able to compile. And so, again, that's an undercount, but that's the big picture. And from that, we know basic things like when the firms became benefit corporations. And then to get some more detailed information on what these firms were doing, I went in and took a random sample of 10% of the firms that had been created as of March 2017, and to get kind of a national portrait. And so for those, my research team and I went in and looked at the web content, looked at social media, looked at their benefit reports if they produced them, to understand what the firms said that they were doing, what they said they were selling, again, the benefits they said they were providing. And so a number can you hear me now? Apologies about that. We're back. Okay.
Yes, okay, you're back.
Right. Okay. That means someone in my household probably went on Wi-Fi.
Yeah, that's what happens, and I think all of our viewers today understand that, you know, we're doing all of this remotely. In fact, the team that's helping us do this webcast is in Europe helping us do this, so we are a global and sort of remote enterprise doing the best we can. So I think people understand there's some technical challenges.
I appreciate that. So that's the design of the study, the big picture of what the firms are, and then going in and digging in, looking at the websites, where I found about 40% I could get really detailed information online, and another 11% I could at least get their industry. So that's where the data comes from.
Got it. Great. And any other comments you'd like to make about the findings at this point, or I've got a question for... I can jump ahead and talk about the findings. That'd be helpful, or feel free to lead. Okay, so you know, I guess Holly. So that's great sort of background on the benefit corporations. Could you talk a little bit about B Corps? Okay, different from benefit corporations. B Corps. How many there are in the United States? What kind of companies and industries are represented, and so forth?
Sure. So there are roughly 3,200 certified B corporations throughout the world. Roughly half of those are in the United States and Canada. They're in 70 different countries overall and 150 industries. The industry with the highest number of B Corps is the food and beverage industry, actually. And I'm sure many of us know examples from that industry, including Ben & Jerry's, Cabot Creamery, Danone, the giant French dairy company. They have a lot of their different subsidiaries certified by us. Stonyfield Yogurt. There are a lot of companies also in management and financial consulting, home and personal care, IT and software, and then apparel and footwear, like Allbirds and Patagonia. But it really stretches the gamut between, all different types of industries as well as all sizes. So we have, very, very small, 2-person consulting firms, and then very, very large manufacturing firms. And what's great is that the impact assessment, which all certified B corporations have to use to demonstrate their social and environmental performance, actually changes depending on what your industry is, where you're actually located, and how big you are. That way you don't have that 2-person consulting company that's based in Denver, Colorado, for example, taking the same assessment as a 3,000 person manufacturing company based in India. It just would not be comparable across those types of industries, locations, and sizes. But luckily the assessment actually does change.
Got it. Interesting. So that's helpful on B Corps. Back to benefit corporations. Ellen, do you want to share? We've got some questions from the audience about, I think, exactly what you're going to talk about, which is the types of industries, the types of companies, and so forth that have embraced
Right. All right. And Tim Powell says, if you knew the next question. All right. So when we look at, first of all,
exactly
I'll talk about the locations where we're finding.
That was not a planted question in the audience, but thank you for your question, Tim, and it's spot on.
So first, if we look at where are the firms forming, we can see that the states that have the greatest proportion of benefit corporations across the country is by far and away Oregon, and that is one of the states that's made it very quite easy to become a benefit corporation, followed by New York and Nevada, and then Delaware. And Nevada is also another state that's made it quite easy to form. I've provided this slide as a point of comparison, the proportion of small U.S. firms in each of those states, to help put these figures in perspective. So while Oregon is certainly leading in terms of benefit corporations, it's not a heavy player in terms of its proportion of small U.S. firms. It's only got 1% of the country's small firms. So we're not, that's definitely not mirroring the broader field of small companies. And I think a lot of that goes back to what the ease of becoming a benefit corporation at the state level, or with somewhere like Delaware, because Delaware is so central to corporate law and corporate incorporation. That's not quite as surprising either, that there's so much activity in Delaware.
Yeah, but it is interesting that Delaware really over-indexes here for benefit corporations as compared to the proportion of small firms. We all know that major corporations are incorporated in Delaware. But this is, the comparison here is small firms, where Delaware has a really quite small percentage, but they've got a fairly large percentage. I know I'm going outside your circle here, but they've got a fairly large percentage of, relatively, of benefit corporations.
And so then in terms of the industries where we're seeing the benefit corporations, by far and away, professional services is the industry where we're seeing the most. And so the professional services will include consulting, scientific research and development, marketing, law firms in the category. And then followed by wholesale retail. So it's going to be similar to the Ben & Jerry's. For example, a lot of this is clothing and sporting goods, food, or health and personal care. And then because there's more of a drop-off, but followed by healthcare, social services, education, information technology, and finance and real estate. So again, as kind of point of comparison, thinking about this in relation to small U.S. firms, we're seeing benefit corporations are really overrepresented in professional services by 13 percentage points. So this is a legal form that's appealing to a lot of people, for example, working in marketing. In wholesale retail, also overrepresented. And then the numbers are really small because there's so few small companies in the U.S. in agriculture, but noticeably more benefit corporations in agriculture than there are regular small U.S. firms. And then one of the concerns about benefit corporations was that they would be early on they might be siphoning off organizations that otherwise become nonprofits. I don't know if siphoning isn't quite a negative word, but there was some concern about that, and I definitely did not find that happening. That benefit corporations are really underrepresented in education, healthcare, and social services especially. So we're not seeing, so these are really companies becoming benefit corporations, because nonprofits can as well. I didn't see that happening.
Great. So got some really good questions here on these last couple of slides. I'd like to, first, a methodological question. Ellen, how did you define small?
Oh, yes, this is a great question. This is working with the data from the Small Business Administration produced by the U.S. government. So surprisingly enough, they define small as being under 500 employees. So I included those firms, and I also included firms, included firms that are employer operated, so that where it's only the owner and no additional employees.
Great. And another question, again, these are great questions from the audience. I wish I had thought of them, but thank you, audience. Could you say a little bit more about what Oregon and some other states are doing to facilitate and support the formation of benefit corporations that maybe other states aren't doing right now?
I'll say a little bit about this, and I hope then you jump in also, Holly. So so my research team also went in and looked at the state websites to look at that process of either filling out the paperwork or using an online portal to become a benefit corporation, to understand how easy just that technical process was. So places like Nevada and Oregon made that very easy in terms of kind of just the technological threshold. Nevada is, among people who research this and work in advocacy in this area, is well known for just having a checkbox and so where you can decide if you're beneficial or not. So the bar is extremely low, and that's why one of the reasons why we think Nevada has, I don't have the data up, but has this disproportionate number of firms that don't look like they're doing anything beneficial. Holly, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just on the Oregon piece, one thing that might differentiate their population from other states is that Oregon actually offers a benefit company status, which includes LLCs. So you can opt into that status as an LLC or as a corporation. And so they might be attracting a larger number of companies because they allow for LLCs to also use it. That's just one aside. Oregon is similar to Nevada in that I believe it's just a similar kind of style checkbox on their incorporation form.
So it's easy to do, and they've got this LLC. And toss the question out to you. Why would some states allow LLCs to qualify as benefit companies, not benefit corporations, and other states wouldn't? Since LLC is such a popular form of for business and legal form for business, provides great tax advantages as well as some of the standard protections in terms of liability. Why would some states have LLCs and others not? Holly, do you want to?
Sure. So when we first created the benefit corporation statute and went around trying to get it passed into law, we were doing it because there are facets of a traditional corporation that actually prevent a mission-driven entrepreneur from having a purpose and protecting that purpose over time as they scale. And so what we were doing when creating the benefit corporation was really creating an option for those types of entrepreneurs who wanted to use the corporate model, but at the same time have a mission, and giving them a way to do that. LLCs, on the other hand, have all the flexibility inherent in contract law. And so they can actually just build in purpose and mission into their existing operating agreement. So in reality, from a legal perspective, you don't need a benefit LLC to operate like a benefit corporation.
Got it.
However, states do like, and entrepreneurs like the idea of an off-the-shelf, easy to go, just, incorporate as this benefit LLC model. And so in recent years, Maryland was actually the first one to do this. States have passed benefit LLC models. So if you can actually be in a benefit LLC, I'm probably going to forget one of the states, but Maryland, Oregon, Utah, Pennsylvania, and Delaware.
Okay.
I think that's the list.
That's pretty darn impressive. But that's a great segue to what I'd like to talk about next, which is really understanding some of the benefits. And that was a helpful segue talking about LLCs versus corporations. I'd like to understand some of the benefits of benefit corporations. So one argument is that they provide greater protection to directors than they would otherwise have. Can you talk a bit about that, Holly?
Sure. So, well, I mentioned the fiduciary duty of a traditional corporation. And under a traditional corporation, the fiduciary duty of the directors is to basically create value, maximize value for the shareholders. And any other stakeholder is easily forced aside in a traditional corporation. Obviously, traditional corporations do lots of amazing things, and they do benefit their stakeholders. But when in situations where the rubber really hits the road, when they're experiencing a downturn or at the time of sale, those stakeholders are easily pushed aside and forgotten. Mm-hmm. Shareholders always win. This is especially true in any type of situation where there's potentially a trade-off between a shareholder value and stakeholder value. In a traditional corporation, in that trade-off scenario, the shareholder always wins. Under a benefit corporation, that's not true, actually. A director actually has the freedom and the flexibility to consider their stakeholders in their decision-making process. That's the fiduciary duty of a director under a benefit corporation.
In fact, they not only have the freedom and flexibility, they're required to consider them. They're not to pursue them, exactly. But they have to consider them, right? Yeah.
Exactly. There's no stipulated end game or result for that consideration, but they must ensure that they're actually considering their stakeholders in their decision making. So the additional freedom for directors is really that ability to prioritize stakeholders in those trade-off scenarios, whereas a traditional corporation would have to prioritize their shareholders in the trade-off. A benefit corporation has the flexibility to say, you know what? In this situation, I need to prioritize my stakeholders.
Got it. And we'll get into some of those dynamics later as to why maybe more companies don't convert over to being benefit corporations given that benefit. But the next question I'd like to ask is, so that's additional protections for directors. But another benefit of benefit corporations is, has been pointed out in Ellen's piece and others, is that there's this additional benefit for shareholders, additional rights for shareholders. So usually there's a tension. You give more protection to directors, that means the shareholders have less in the way of authority. But with benefit corporations, there's also some additional benefits for the shareholders. So could you talk a little bit about that too, Holly?
Sure. So the Benefit Corp statutes provide shareholders with a private right of action. They can actually sue the company if the company is failing to pursue their general public benefit purpose, mm-hmm. or to consider their stakeholders adequately. Essentially, that what they're provided in that suit is injunctive relief, which means the company actually just has to go back and correct what they did wrong. There's no monetary liability. They're not monetary liable for what they did, but it helps the shareholders really act as enforcement mechanisms for that general public benefit purpose and that stakeholder consideration. So this, in the same way that shareholders are the enforcement mechanism for a traditional corporation and their pursuit of profit, shareholders are the enforcement mechanism for benefit corporations and their pursuit of general public benefit purpose and stakeholder consideration.
Got it. But through injunctive relief, not monetary relief, which exactly. is a relief to the directors and to the company in a way. So one of the differences that between B Corps and benefit corporations that was highlighted in your piece, Ellen, is that unlike B Corps, benefit corporations being a benefit corporation doesn't seem to necessarily provide a great reputational boost to a company, or companies aren't taking advantage of that. Because B Corps, you've got a certification, people are going out and saying, hey, we're a B Corp. But that's not true with the benefit corporations as much. Can you explain a little bit why that is,
Sure.
Ellen?
So when I went in and looked at the firm's websites to understand how they were describing themselves, I looked at, do they have text on being a benefit corporation? And I was really surprised to find that 71% of firms made no mention of being a benefit corporation online. And another 19% only mentioned it briefly. So that leaves us with 10% of the firms really had kind of a longer statement connecting being a benefit corporation to their mission. It was clear that the folks running the company identified strongly with being a benefit corporation. So I take this as a sign, if you've got 71% of benefit corporations not mentioning that they're benefit corporations, is that they don't see this as a marketing tool. Right? And again, that was one of the early arguments for benefit corporations, is this is great signaling to other firms, to investors of companies, the seriousness with which it was kind of treating its social mission. As for why this would be the case, I can conjecture about that. I think some of this goes back to our earlier conversation about the differences between benefit corporations and B Corp. I think benefit corporations are difficult to understand. It takes more than, maybe the easiest way to say it is that the firm has a legal status, so that shareholders are not valued above all else. You could say something about shareholder supremacy. I think that's like the easiest sentence to roll off your tongue. But beyond that, I find this when I'm at cocktail parties and talking about my research, and I start saying that I'm studying benefit corporations, and then just like eyes glaze over, because it's hard to translate in a simple way.
But by the way, you're not alone. A lot of us who have labored in the governance area for a lot of years, maybe it's just us, I don't know, but eyes glaze over a whole lot.
Right.
So
then you bring
don't
up
take it
law,
personally.
right? You bring up law, and it's unless you're at a cocktail party with lawyers.
Right. Yeah.
Within the kind of the social enterprise ecology, within the field of companies that are kind of really deeply invested in lots of ways of being beneficial, when I saw firms that are selling products or services that clearly have a benefit, that are serving other social enterprises that have incorporated being beneficial into the way their operations. When I saw benefits happening in a firm on multiple levels, those were the companies that were most likely to say they're benefit corporations. So I think within that field of socially minded firms, the term means something. I think outside of that, it's difficult to communicate about.
Got it. So let me ask you both a question before we talk about conversions. It seems like there may be this unrealized potential here for benefit corporations to do a little bit more in terms of, using that status for their reputation. As difficult as that may be to convey at cocktail parties and so forth. But what are some of the other potential benefits of benefit corporations that may not have been realized yet, that you think are areas of opportunities for benefit corporations that they could perhaps seize? And maybe I'll start with Holly and then Ellen. Do you have thoughts about that?
I think that their moment is coming. First, what I think their moment is coming for pre-IPO and public companies. Mm-hmm. I think that as more and more companies that were founded by not necessarily millennials, but people in that general age range move towards IPOs, I think the benefit corporation will become more and more important. As you think about IPOing a company that actually has a mission or a purpose, which many of these founders have thought about and protected for years, the prospect of entering the public markets is daunting. You have a lot of different pressures that are going to push and pull that mission and force you to really, really focus on shareholder value above all else. And I think that the benefit corporation can be an incredibly important signaling device, protection device, bring on, potentially shareholders that view you in a different way with a longer term, investing mandate. So I personally think that this is the benefits of it for pre-IPO companies and potentially also for public companies have yet to be really fully realized.
Yeah. And Ellen, any thoughts on
Sure.
that as well?
From reading so many of these websites and the about pages and how people describe their social mission, and when they talk about being a benefit corporation, when they describe that, what really struck me is that it seems like for a lot of these business owners, having a social mission or an environmental mission is a really important part of their identity, as likely as people and certainly as business owners. And so I've come to think about this legal form as likely helping to facilitate the formation of business, right? If creating a business, part of that is, especially for new entrepreneurs, adopting the identity of an entrepreneur. But so imagine you want to start a company, but you kind of don't see yourself as sort of the stereotypical big bad capitalist. You think of who you are and what you're trying to do as in different kinds of terms. Then I think becoming a benefit corporation is one way that people can sort of maintain that consistency in terms of living up to their own personal ideals, but also kind of having a legal form that better fits their understanding of what their company is up to. So again, I think about the status as likely facilitating entrepreneurs and jump into becoming business owners, which it's fantastic if that's working that way.
That's really interesting. And a question from the audience, and I'll expand on it. Are you aware of any companies that are out there that are doing a really good job of taking their status of as a benefit corporation and making it highlighted for consumers and employees as well, who are really using this effectively to attract customers, attract and retain employees?
One of the firms that really stood out for me was a company called Mighty Bites in Chicago that does online development. I'm guessing, Holly, you're familiar with them as well. A really interesting firm that, again, is working on being beneficial in terms of who it sells its services to, in terms of what's going on within the company's operations, and also as being active within getting legislation passed within Illinois and being spokespeople for it. So I could see them operating on multiple levels, not just in terms of their own business, but politically engaging. But Holly, I'm sure you're also, more directly in contact with folks doing this work too.
Yeah, and I think there are some great examples. Patagonia is the classic one. They lean into their benefit corporation status, talk about it quite a lot, actually use it in their own work, both kind of from a marketing perspective, from an employee engagement perspective, from a stakeholder perspective, but then also from their own kind of government advocacy perspective. I think that there are some pretty amazing younger firms out there that are doing a good job. Allbirds, if you read pretty much any article or interview with their founder, he talks a lot about it. And they founded their entity, Allbirds, as a benefit corporation. I think there are some really great examples out there of companies who have leaned into the status as a way to really communicate that their mission and purpose is going to survive over time to their employees. It's a great, attraction and retention of employees tool, because a lot of employees now are really looking for a purposeful work environment, and they want to see that purpose is real and isn't just lip service. And the benefit corporation is a great way to communicate that. I know that Kickstarter does a lot about that.
Great.
And then there are, the older firms who are thinking about this from a kind of a what's the next step for my business? I'm about to retire. How do I, the benefit corporation is a great way to bake in the mission and purpose before I leave the company.
Great. But that's really helpful. So let's talk about, so So, and we'll get more into this later. So this may really be a moment for benefit corporations. But one of the most striking things, and there's a question from the audience about this as well, is that, 94% of the benefit corporations out there, according to your study, Ellen, were, started as benefit corporations. There have only been 6% of the benefit corporations out there in the US have converted. So if there are truly all these benefits to being a benefit corporation, to both directors, shareholders, maybe attracting customers, retaining employees, um, a whole bunch of potential benefits. Why haven't more companies converted over to being a benefit corporation? And Holly, maybe you want to take the lead on that one.
Sure. So I think that there's a few things at play here. I think that there's still a lack of knowledge about
Mm-hmm.
the benefit corporation concept. I mean, I think this webinar proves it. I had to start out the beginning of the webinar explaining the differences between certified B Corps and benefit corporations. And so there's still confusion. There's still a lack of knowledge, both among entrepreneurs, but then also among the various and kind of touch points in the entrepreneurial ecosystem that advise an entrepreneur, whether it's a lawyer, an investor, or an accountant, about what this is, the benefits, and the fact that there really aren't that many downsides to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that lack of knowledge is preventing or potentially presenting a barrier for some later stage firms in the conversion process. One of the reasons why there's a barrier is because in many states, a conversion requires a higher vote. So it requires a 2/3 vote of your shareholders. And in some states, it also triggers something called appraisal rights or dissenters' rights, which essentially means that if you vote no, you abstain, or you don't vote, you as a shareholder are entitled to the fair market value of their shares. Of your shares. And this, as you can imagine, can be super scary for a company. This is not a liquidity scenario. You don't have a bunch of cash sitting around to buy out those shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
And so for later stage companies that have complicated cap tables, this can be, a complicated and concerning process. But what's good is that very few people actually ever have used the appraisal rights or the
Mm-hmm.
dissenters' rights in this conversion process. It's expensive to do. You have to hire a lawyer and an expert and go to court. So for the most part, it's once firms have actually gone through the process, it hasn't been a barrier, but it's definitely kind of a mental and emotional barrier when considering conversion. And the prospect of, having to educate all your investors, having to get your attorney on board,
Mm-hmm.
it's a more complicated process for existing firms with large shareholder bases than it is for an entrepreneur just starting out.
Right. Yeah. It's having to go to a shareholder vote and get a a sort of supermajority in favor that's a daunting prospect for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
companies. But if do you think some larger companies should be considering this, Holly, at this stage? And also, if they are considering it, is there a does the jurisdiction matter? Is it better to incorporate in Delaware or somewhere else? Do you stay with the same state you're incorporating in? I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts about
Yeah.
big companies that may be considering it. Should they even? And if so, does the state of incorporation matter?
I think big companies should definitely consider this, especially if they see an IPO in their future. I think that this is going to become part of a standard IPO package personally. Um, I think that in terms of incorporation jurisdiction, I'm not going to play favorites in terms of one state versus another. But I think if you're an entrepreneur and you plan to raise outside capital, you plan to go to get VC dollars. The most likely scenario is that those VCs are going to require you to incorporate in Delaware anyway. So if your path includes outside capital, I would assume that incorporating in Delaware would be a smart move to make.
Got it. Okay. And before we turn, because I've got a couple more questions. Ellen, I'd like to just ask you, because you've given a lot of thought to the policy side of this. Are there some things that based on your analysis thus far, that you think policymakers should be doing to facilitate the adoption of benefit corporations, or to help maximize the benefits out of those benefit corporations?
Sure. So I think the benefit corporation form has really been oriented toward firms that are looking to raise outside capital, are looking to go to angel investors or venture capital. But most of these firms are not going to be in that position of going public. So I think we're due for a conversation about what it means to what those small businesses need in terms of their capital needs. So I think that is one place where I can't say necessarily have answers for that, but a conversation I think really needs to open up around that and what the capital needs are of those firms. I think on the legislative side that I'm concerned that the bar is too low to becoming a benefit corporation, and that that so many firms are becoming benefit corporations that really probably shouldn't be. That and likely because many of them, the business owners, don't understand what the benefit corporation form is. They're looking at the checkbox. Sounds good. I'm not that I'm not beneficial, you know. So I worry that this over adoption is sort of diluting the value of the category of the purposes that it being a benefit corporation, if that legal form is supposed to be a signal of sort of authentically being a social enterprise. And then the mechanisms for accountability aren't working either. So in many states, firms, benefit corporations are required to produce an annual report. The report, but there doesn't seem to be any kind of real enforcement of that. And so if you think kind of a report is the way, at least for the public to know what this firm is really doing, what I found is that in states that require the public posting of a benefit report, only 6% of firms were putting their benefit reports online. And other scholars who have looked at this on a smaller scale have found similar findings, under 10% of benefit report posting where firms are supposed to be doing it. So there's a real need to kind of revisit the oversight mechanisms and mechanisms for accountability, which is definitely a challenge given how decentralized the law is. We've got, you know, B-Lab has done an amazing job creating model legislation that lots of states have adopted, but we've got, you know, states often tinker with that as well. So we're seeing different forms now across 38 states. So I'm well aware that doing those reforms is a big task.
Got it. All right. Yeah, and you know, there's a challenge because you're talking about sort of maybe shrinking the pool of companies who should really be going after benefit corporations. They've got additional obligations. They've got to meet higher standards. But maybe by doing that, then it has greater meaning and impact. Maybe moving a little bit more toward a B Corp. So let's talk a bit, before we have a wrap-up question, about B Corp certifications and reporting. So Holly, it seems like, you know, to be a B Corp, as you mentioned at the outset, you need to meet certain criteria. You know, right now a lot of companies are struggling with having to report against multiple ESG reporting frameworks, with having to deal with, you know, they're not all of them, but there are about over 200 rating agencies out there that are grading companies on ESG factors. Does being a B Corp increase the burden for companies? Does it help decrease the burden for companies in trying to deal with all these different frameworks to prove that they're good corporate citizens?
I don't think that we decrease it necessarily. Okay. You know, we've tried to align with a lot of the other standards out there. So we've worked with many different standards organizations, GRI and SASB and all of the big ones. I will say for the most part, certified B Corps today are smaller firms. Mm-hmm. So they're not subject to many of these kind of, you know, very onerous disclosure requirements, or not requirements, but disclosure rules and different rubrics. So for like smaller firms that aren't public, this might be their only actual ESG report. But for public companies, I agree. Like there are so many different standards out there, and companies are really clamoring for a standardized approach. I think the certification and the B Impact assessment generally will always be kind of unique and different from those because we are actually, it's not public data that we're relying on. The companies are actually voluntarily uploading their own internal data, which we don't provide externally, of course, but our certification is based on that internal data. So it's very different from like a just capital rating or any of that kind of stuff. But I think that's what, your concern for public companies is very true. And I hope we're going to a period of time at this moment when we can kind of all come together and work towards unity on the disclosure front, both in terms of what standards, but then also in hopefully advocating for expanded disclosure requirements or at least guidelines on ESG.
Got it. So I think you've already both touched on this, but I'd like to give you a chance for, quick concluding comments. As we emerge from this pandemic, and we will, it seems like there really is a moment here for ESG, which already had a lot of force behind it, to emerge even more powerfully with a focus on employee safety, employee health, economic security, supply chain sustainability. All these issues, I think, will be likely highlighted. So in that context, any further thoughts on the role of benefit corporations and B Corps as we come out of this?
I think one question is what's going to happen to all these firms that already are benefit corporations. So I think we're likely going to see the same problems that all kinds of small firms across the country, across the United States are experiencing. We're likely going to see that in the benefit corporation space as well. So there will be lots of folding, lots of inactivity. That's there's one question of how do we support those companies that are already benefit corporations in kind of riding out this wave. And I'm not sure that there's anything that would be that different than supporting a regular small business as well. They're going to have the same kinds of concerns. Or do I? Can I open up my retail space? Well, I have consumers.
Right.
So that's one piece of it. And the other question is then, how can we use the post-COVID moment, because that will come eventually, we're all looking forward to that, to hopefully shore up the law, to kind of as a moment to revisit what pieces here can we make stronger, how can we better explain the benefit corporation form to make that more legible and accessible, how can we improve some of the accountability mechanisms. I hope it's a moment where folks are willing to kind of go back and say, like, how do we kind of do 2.0 of the law.
And Holly, are you gearing up with for an increased interest in B Corp certifications as well, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent quite a lot of the last few weeks working to support the existing certified B Corp community, just to help make sure that they survive this crisis in the same way that Ellen described. I've, for example, spent quite a bit of the last 2 weeks neck deep in the CARES Act and understanding the Paycheck Protection Program and ensuring that the B Corps have all of the information they need to take advantage of that really important opportunity. A lot of our firms are under 500 employees and can, really benefit from that money. I think that in the future, and I really truly believe this, that this is a time to build a new social contract between business and society. We can't go back. It's a time to rebuild our economy in a way that it is more inclusive and equitable and regenerative. I also personally believe that the federal stimulus packages should be used to serve workers and communities to ensure that we're more resilient for the future.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, if you're going to use public dollars, you should be serving the public. And so I think that there's a role that benefit corporation can potentially play there. But I think hopefully that's not too optimistic. But I really think that we have a moment right now where we can think about a new normal and hopefully build that new normal.
Great. And benefit corporations and B Corps will certainly be an important part of that. And so thank you so much to both of you for today. And to the audience, thank you for your questions. Please don't forget to complete the evaluation form so that we can incorporate your feedback in future webcasts. And to conclude, I also just want to remind our viewer that the Conference Board is marshaling its global resources to address the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd encourage everyone to visit our website, conference-board.org. There's a hub there for all kinds of information to help companies of all types navigate this unprecedented crisis. There's just a wealth of resources that the Conference Board is a nonprofit. We have a societal mission, so we're making all of this information available for free to the public. So I'd encourage everyone to visit it. And so thank you again to our excellent panelists and to all of you for listening today. Thank you.
Thank you.